Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, March 20th, the first day of spring, in the studios of Urbana Public Television in Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est, odisse cum laeseris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about American war-making. There's no mystery to the ideological collapse of U.S. ruling class politics under the late stages of capitalism and imperial decline in which we find ourselves today. Simply put, the corporate duopoly parties, duopoly ruled by the two parties, Republican and Democrat, the corporate duopoly parties have nothing to offer the masses of people except unrelenting austerity at home and endless wars abroad. A shrunken and privatized Detroit serves as a model for U.S. urban policy. Libya and Syria are the scorched earth footprints of a demented and dying empire. The lengthening shadow of economic eclipse by the East, China primarily, leaves the U.S. lords of capital with no cards left to play but the threat of Armageddon. As China regains its historic place in the center of the earth, alongside the huge and heavily armed landmass of Russia, Washington flails about in a frenzy of firewall building, buying time with the blood of millions, hoping to somehow preserve its doomed hegemony. But the exceptional superpower, exceptional is the term America applies to itself, the exceptional superpower has no Marshall Plan, like the post-World War II plan for Europe, has no Marshall Plan to rescue itself from the throes of systemic decay of the one world controlled by the United States. And all that it can offer to the emerging nations of the world is a bad example and the threat of annihilation. Its own people, Americans, tire of the great game, American imperialism, particularly in Asia, finally realizing that they are the ones who have been played. Americans are the ones who have been played. George Bush drawled the last hurrah of empire with his declaration of mission accomplished 15 years ago after the attack on Iraq, and he was quickly contradicted. With the failure in Iraq, the pretense of spreading democracy came ingloriously undone. A refurbishing of the imperial brand was attempted with a bright and shiny new face, a black face, Barack Obama, plus a new logo to justify invasion and regime change. Humanitarian intervention was what we called it. But Obama's assault on Syria revealed that the U.S. and its junior partners, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia, could only project power in the region through an alliance with Islamic jihadist terror, That is the terrorism of fanatical Islam, which the U.S. sponsored in Syria and elsewhere. The architects of the war on terror were, in fact, the godfathers of al-Qaeda. The Americans who invented the war on terror were, in fact, the sponsors of the terrorists of al-Qaeda. The 9/11 was a blowback of the sponsorship of terrorism that the U.S. had been doing since the Carter administration. Quote, "Do you realize now what you've done?" Vladimir Putin demanded of the Americans at the United Nations in 2015. Quote, "It is hypocritical and irresponsible to make loud declarations about the threat of international terrorism while turning a blind eye to the channels of financing and supporting terrorists, including the process of trafficking and illicit trade in oil and arms, which the U.S. is doing. It would be equally irresponsible to try to manipulate extremist groups and place them at one's service in order to achieve one's own political goals in the hope of later dealing with them, or in other words, liquidating them," close quote. That's Vladimir Putin describing 3 years ago what the U.S. was doing with these jihadist groups in the Middle East. It was sponsoring them and using it against its enemies, notably the government of Syria, with the idea that that the U.S. would deal with these terrorists later after they had done what the U.S. wanted done. Washington's jihadist strategy has rapidly unraveled ever since. The empire was unmasked in the world's most public forum, revealing the utter depravity of U.S. policy and, more importantly, the weakness of Washington's position in the region. The mighty fortress of global capital, the self-appointed defender of the world economic order, that is the U.S., was revealed as not just in collusion with head-chopping, women-enslaving, sectarian, mass-murdering terrorists, but militarily dependent on the very forces it claims to wage a twilight generational battle to destroy. That is, the Islamic terrorists in the Middle East that the U.S. said it was attacking, but was in fact using to accomplish its own goals, notably the overthrow of Syria. The U.S. has been spouting the mother of all lies, and most of humanity knows it. Deep down, most Americans suspect as much, too. With its intervention in Syria as a stalwart foe of jihadism and its defense of the principle of national sovereignty, Russia spoke the language of international law and morality, presenting a fundamental challenge to U.S. imperial exceptionalism. By deploying his forces against Washington's jihadist proxies in a region infested with American bases, Putin put muscle behind his call for a multipolar world order, one in which a number of nations cooperated, not just the U.S. gave orders. China understands clearly that the ultimate U.S. aim is to block China's access to the region's energy and markets at will. Beijing has praised Russia's military role in the war in Syria and stood with Moscow in vetoing Western Security Council resolutions targeting Damascus, that is, the government of President Assad. China routinely joins with Russia and most other nations on the planet in pursuit of a more multipolar world, one in which not only the U.S. is in charge. The U.S. now uses the desperate Kurdish militia as surrogates in Syria, an attempt to justify its presence in the country, while continuing to arm, finance, and train other rebel groups, reportedly including former ISIS fighters. The U.S. has always avoided targeting the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front, which, with ISIS on the run, remains the most effective anti-government force in the country. Anti the government in Damascus, the legitimate government of Syria, presided over by President Assad. The Trump administration declares that it will remain in Syria for the foreseeable future, even without a fig leaf of legal cover. The U.S. has no legal right to be killing people in Syria. Although there is now no possibility for a jihadist victory, the Islamic terrorist that the U.S. was sponsoring, Washington seems intent on drawing out the war as long as possible. The truth is, Washington doesn't know how to extricate itself, because to do so would amount to yet another admission of defeat and lead quickly to this dissolution of the jihadist networks the Pentagon has so long cultivated. Withdrawal from Syria, and sooner rather than later from Iraq, whose parliament this month called for a timetable for U.S. forces to vacate the country, would totally unravel U.S. strategy to dominate events in the oil-rich region. Obama launched the jihadist war, the terrorist wars, against the Syrian government in 2011 to force his way into the country. ISIS's seizure of Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, gave the U.S. the opportunity to return to that country militarily. There will be no third chances in Syria or Iraq. The American people will not stand for another such adventure. They feel tainted by the experience in both Syria and Iraq and don't trust what their government says about the good guys and bad guys in the Arab world. If only for reasons of racism, they want out. Everyone smells U.S. defeat inside and outside the empire. It's a stink that only Americans that were conscious in the Vietnam era can remember, like me. It makes folks anxious, like the loss of a cocoon. Just as whites reaped a psychological wage from Jim Crow privileges, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, even if they were poor, so do citizens of empire feel psychological benefits even when the cost of the war machine is impoverishing the country. U.S. politics in the era of imperial decline will be nasty, stupid, petty, and racist, just as we're already experiencing. There must be scapegoats for the national de-exceptionalization, the removal of America as the unipolar center of the world. The Russians fit the bill for now, and so does anybody that talks like a Russian or a Chinese, for example, people that would like to live in a multipolar world. Do not expect the Republicans or the Democrats to make any sense of a world of diminishing empire. The duopolists, double rule of the two parties, are incapable of seeing any future beyond their rich patrons' vision. And the rich, the 1%, have no vision beyond continued accumulation of wealth, which requires a harsher and harsher austerity. Most dangerous, they cannot imagine a world in which they are not on top. We will have to fight to keep them from blowing us all up in rich man's despair. You're listening to Aware on the Air, an attempt by local members of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana to talk about what's not being talked about in mainstream media, that is, the U.S. war-making around the world. In an interview with the Russian broadcaster RT, discussing the recent nerve agent poisoning of a former Russian spy in Britain, veteran Australian journalist John Pilger has argued that, quote, this is a carefully constructed drama as part of the propaganda campaign that is building for several years to justify the actions of NATO, Britain, and the United States towards Russia. The attack targeted former double agent Sergei Skripal, 66 years old, who was found unconscious along with his daughter Yulia, 33 years old, on a bench in the city of Salisbury on March 4th, and both victims remain in hospital in critical condition. Skripal is a retired Russian military intelligence colonel who was convicted of treason in Russia in 2006 for transferring Russian intelligence agents' identity to Britain's secret intelligence service. Quote, this is so dangerous, with Russia being effectively pushed into a corner with these accusations, Pilger warned, it's part of a propaganda campaign promoted specifically in the media and in the government. Russia is ringed by missiles. It has NATO right up to its western border. This is unprecedented since the Second World War. Most people in Britain, most people in the United States don't understand these dangers, the dangers of this propaganda. Now this drama about whether or not Skripal was poisoned by Novichok, the word, in fact, bad Russian, coined to describe this poison that supposedly came from Russia to attack Skripal and his daughter. It's up to the UK government to supply evidence, even the most basic prima facie evidence, that Russia is in any way responsible for this. Russia's nerve gas program was verified as destroyed in September 2013 by the United Nations watchdog, unlike the United States, which had promised to do the same thing and didn't. Last Saturday, Radio Free Europe quoted Russia scientist Vil Murzianov, who wrote the book State Secrets, an Insider's Chronicle of the Russian chemical weapons program, and is known to have helped develop the nerve agent called Novichok. And she said during an interview, the British could certainly have synthesized it on the basis of the formulas that I published in my book. Each country takes care of its own security, and as part of the study of possible threats, a model could have been created. So many countries could have had test samples, but production was only refined in the USSR and Russia. Most people in the world in Britain don't understand the dangers of such propaganda. Last week, UK Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn also warned Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, to take a, quote, calm, measured approach and not rush way ahead of the evidence in connection to the recent attack. Corbyn said the United Kingdom should not jump to conclusions, warning against the McCarthyite intolerance of dissent over Russia. Quote, this horrific event demands, first of all, the most thorough and painstaking criminal investigation conducted by our police and security services, Corbyn said. To rush way ahead of the evidence being gathered by the police in a fevered parliamentary atmosphere serves neither justice nor our national security, close quote. But it does serve the British and American government's demonization of Russia, which was the policy of the last administration and it's in America and seems to have been adopted by the current administration as well. Prime Minister May of Great Britain gave quite a statement, a real mix of fact, assumed fact. It's assumed that this couple, father and daughter, are in the hospital, well, even that's been questioned, and fiction. It's not clear which elections she accuses any Russians with having interfered with, but there's no evidence to back up the many claims of such so far. It's telling that she would conflate, the Prime Minister of Britain, would conflate being poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent, which they claim is what happened in Salisbury, with meddling in elections. This is being used as a reason to foment war against Russia. These notes are from our research director, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson. The Prime Minister says the nerve agent is of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Don't most large countries have a lot of the same common knowledge? Not quite the same as a clear identification that the nerve agent came from Russia, was a state-sponsored attack, and remarkably targeted relative to how the U.S. apparently carries out drone warfare. This is all that's being assumed, by the British Prime Minister with little or no evidence. She lumps in a bunch of other allegations with no clear connection to what happened in Salisbury, some of which are so common, including among UK spies, such as the cyber espionage and disruption, that they seem desperate. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea is thrown in. That's not an accurate description. Was the first time since the Second World War that one sovereign nation had forcibly taken territory for another in Europe. This is the fantasy that's coming from Britain. Quote, Russia has fomented conflict in the Donbass. The conflict in the Donbass is a reaction to the American-sponsored overthrow of the legitimate government of Ukraine and the unwillingness of the Donbass region, the eastern region of Ukraine, to be ruled by the American-installed government. The Prime Minister of Britain goes on, Russia has repeatedly violated the national airspace of several European countries and mounted a sustained campaign of cyber espionage and disruption. This has included meddling in election and hacking the Danish Ministry of Defense and the Bundestag, the German parliament, among many others, close quote. A strategy I take to mean that she's eager to give Western countries an excuse to go to war with Russia, throw up a bunch of reasons, and see what sticks. So says Dr. No, and it seems to me that's quite right. One point, he says, one point stands out to me as cry for war with Russia. She brings up Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations and the extrajudicial killing of terrorists and dissidents outside Russia who were given legal sanction by the Russian parliament in 2006, close quote. How bad is it for the UK being friendly with a country that now in double-digit years of using drones to extrajudicially assassinate people around the world? He means, of course, the United States. The Obama administration killed literally thousands of people with drone assassinations. In a secret war, so no official death counts, by the thousands, including its fellow citizens, Americans were killed by Obama's drones, and children. Talk about threats to civilians. Dr. No continues, overall, I wonder if I'm seeing a bit of Colonel Powell's UN speech before the invasion of Iraq. Specifics aimed at pushing people to act, but in that case all based on lies, and in this case nowhere near a threat that justifies characterization as, quote, an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. This is what the British Prime Minister is making of the Salisbury event. The UK's foreign policies and any foreign policy taken up with the US put UK citizens at far greater risk. President Putin rightly points out that if Russia did want the Skripals dead, they'd be dead. It also looks odd that, according to the Western corporate-friendly media, including the BBC and wannabes like Democracy Now!, Russia is simultaneously smart enough to scuttle the U.S. election for tiny amounts of money, $100,000 to Facebook, but foolish enough to not get away with killing Skripals on sight. All stories offered without evidence, thus all not believable until evidence is offered and evaluated. In another tit-for-tat measure, 23 British diplomats were expelled from Russia, given a week to leave. The UK expelled 23 Russian diplomats after alleging Russia attacked the UK in the Salisbury incident. This is all sounding like Hillary Clinton's baseless claims that whatever constitutes meddling in U.S. elections were Putin's direct orders to troll farms posting stuff on social media. Heaven forbid freedom of speech for the Russians. Meetings are being held, sanctions imposed, chemical weapons research will be conducted, all based on two British citizens, ex-Russian citizens, being very ill from this attack. It's hard to imagine any of this action is being taken on behalf of Russian citizen Yulia Skripal. This really puts into sharp focus how these heads of state don't care about the innocents assassinated in the ongoing drone war matter. Get too close to where those extrajudicial murders take place, and you could be literally vaporized. We're listening to Aware on the Air. We're looking at notes from our research director, J.B. Nicholson, Dr. No, and he has a note on something that may be available around here before long. He's talking about the movie Death of Stalin. I haven't seen the movie, he says, or read the graphic novel it's based on, but there is a good article in The Intercept about the novel and the movie, and it should be looked at in terms of the Russian hysteria, Russiagate in this country, the Skripal matter in Britain that we're getting in the mainstream news. You're watching Aware on the Air. President Trump has lined up closely with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, which is basically an alliance, and he's bitterly opposed to Iran. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley spoke at the UN about Iranian violations of the so-called nuclear deal with Iran. However, the U.S. is violating it all the time. Nobody talks about this. The accord is explicit in terms of the requirement that the signatories do nothing with Iran's commercial relations with the outside. That is, they don't interfere with them. That was the main reason Iran was interested in the deal, because the U.S. was interfering with its economic involvement with the rest of the world, and Iran wanted to put a stop to that. But the U.S. is doing it constantly. Even under the Obama administrations, there were radical violations of the agreement that the Obama administration had signed. Trump is trying everything that he can to destroy the accords. The Europeans are trying to offer some conciliatory measures to keep Trump from pulling out entirely, and that will probably fail. I don't think there's a coherent foreign policy here in the Trump administration. He's been very critical, for example, of Pakistan, and Pakistan is reacting by stepping up bombings by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Support for them. There's a significant likelihood that real hostilities will break out between Israel and Hezbollah, the Shia group in Lebanon, which will probably mean the invasion of Lebanon by Israel. Israel will bombard Lebanon, which will mean the destruction of Lebanon. Israel is committed to their Dahiya doctrine, as they call it, which means that they will go to war against any provocation. And it could just blow up the Iranian installations, which are not too far from the Israeli border. Israel won't allow anything near its borders, so I think this is a very volatile and dangerous situation. Some observers, such as the knowledgeable analyst Nicholas No, are predicting, who not related to our own research director, Dr. No, he spells it differently. Some observers are predicting with a degree of certainty that a serious war launched by Israel could take place, an ugly situation. And of course, in Yemen, the U.S. and Israel, with British backing, are just destroying the country. They're blaming Iran, but it's basically the U.S. and Saudi bombings. So that situation is extremely dangerous and vulnerable. On the other side of the country, Turkey is attacking Syria in order to keep any Kurdish groups, as far as they can, from their borders. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan told a 6-year-old girl she would be honored if she were martyred. I can't imagine what's going on in their minds, the Turks supporting this incursion by the Turkish government. They're very unpredictable and dangerous people, the leaders of Turkey. Similarly, in Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in serious trouble, local political trouble, and it's possible he will try to salvage his situation by undertaking some violent act. All very dangerous. Lebanon will likely be a major victim. If there's another Israeli war, it will be even worse than the last one. The reason that Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia group, by now, according to reports at least, has a very significant missile capacity, which Israel won't be able to stop. If they start hitting Israeli targets, Israel will just go all out without any restraint at all. They might go as far as bombing Iran. The Europeans are trying almost desperately to save something of the Iran deal. I doubt very much that Iran will accept the new proposals that they announced. It seems very unlikely. I'm sure that the European negotiators know that Iran can't accept them. If the U.S. also rejects them, which is very possible, one conceivable outcome is that the U.S. would just withdraw, and the rest of the P5+1, that is the European countries that guaranteed this agreement between the U.S. and Iran, will maintain some kind of relationship with Iran. They don't want to break their relationship with the U.S. either, so they're in a very difficult situation. They don't want to abandon Iran. On the other hand, they're frightened about the U.S. for good reason. Russia and China will maintain a relationship with Iran, but they can't compensate for Western relations. And Iran, of course, has plenty of internal problems as well, not just social and political, but also ecological and climatic concerns. Nevertheless, it seems to me that in spite of these mad policies, President Trump is on a path to be reelected. The Trump administration operates on two planes. On one plane, Trump's role is to attract media attention to make sure he's in the headlines every day. He's the first thing to see on the television every day, and his approval ratings go up along with his visibility. That's why he's doing one crazy thing after another. It's not what it looks like. The media criticizes Trump, which fires up his base because they regard themselves as under attack by the liberal media, as indeed they are. So he plays that game. Underneath, the real villains, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leaders of the Congress, are busily dismantling every aspect of the government that might be of benefit to the general population. They're serving their real constituency, the rich and the corporate sector, with abject dedication to sheer robbery of you and me. The tax bill was a massive gift to the super-rich, with a few pennies to the others just to keep them quiet. Ryan and McConnell, the Republican leaders of Congress, want to have a huge deficit, federal deficit, so that gives the pretext of dismantling Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and food stamps, anything that benefits the general population. In the meantime, keep the base fired up with white nationalism, racism, religious extremism, and so on. It's a very dangerous situation. And parenthetically, we might point out the Democrats are quietly cooperating. It's a very violent country we live in. There are heavily armed militias even around the country, often better armed than the state police, as we saw in Charlottesville. Angry people ready to go to war. If Trump hadn't won the election, we might indeed have had a civil war. I doubt it, I think. But still in all, we should realize the level of unrest of various sorts within the country. You're watching Aware on the Air. We are talking about the activities of the U.S. government in the current situation and the possibilities that the future holds out for us, peculiar as they may be. We'll finish up tonight with a piece of material about from the Real News Network, which I recommend in general. But this was about the visit to the United States of the new ruler of Saudi Arabia, MBS as he's called, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is part of the clientage that the U.S. has established for control of the Middle East. The U.S. principal agents for control of the Middle East are, of course, Israel and Saudi Arabia. They are effective allies as Americans muscle men for control of the region. The U.S. control of the Middle East is about oil, but not in the sense that many Americans once thought it was, that the U.S. needs Middle Eastern oil for our own purposes here at home in the U.S. The U.S. gets very little oil from the Middle East. Most of the oil that we consume domestically is produced domestically in the U.S. or in the Atlantic Basin, as we might say, Canada, Venezuela, and Western Africa, Nigeria. This is the source of most of the oil that we consume domestically. But Middle Eastern oil does fuel the rest of the world. And if the U.S. controls that, by controlling the oil flows from the Middle East, we have a chokehold on countries from Germany to China. This has been true basically since the Second World War, but the U.S. in recent years has used its military might, that is to say, it's been willing to kill a lot of people, in order to make sure that the control of Middle Eastern oil continues. And today that control is exercised by Saudi Arabia and Israel, allies, in spite of all you hear about Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. The effective alliance is between these two vicious militarist powers, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and the purpose, backed by the United States, sponsored by the United States, is the control of the oil that comes out of the Middle East. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign, Urbana, a local peace group, in the 12th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with articles referred to tonight, and also some other things, including Nicholson Baker's important article, Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. He means World War II and its propaganda use in American politics. We'll conclude tonight, as I said, with a piece from the Real News Network on the question of whether Congress will affirm its constitutional power to stop the war in Yemen. The U.S. dog's body, Saudi Arabia, is killing people at a great rate in Yemen for the purposes of Middle Eastern control. And there is actually a move in the U.S. Congress to limit that, to stop that. Senate Joint Resolution 54 is being voted on today or tomorrow, and the plan and the resolution tries to prevent the illegal support for Saudi Arabia's killing in Yemen that the United States is extending by invoking the War Powers Act. It points out that the U.S. has no authority the U.S. government has no authority to aid in the killing of people in Yemen and must withdraw its forces. It will be a close vote in the Senate, and I'm happy to say that at least our local senators seem to be willing to vote in favor of Senate Joint Resolution 54 that tries to stop America's illegal killing in Yemen. The piece that we will run immediately after this is about Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's called universally, who is coming to Washington to lobby support for the war in Yemen. The Constitution and the War Powers Act are very clear that only Congress has the power to authorize war, however, as much as we forget it. So there may indeed be a vote about it this week, and it's important. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Leggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Aware, the local anti-war group, meets every Sunday from 5 to 6 p.m. at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop at University and Wright Streets in Campustown. Friends and members of Aware are invited to the meeting. We discuss what's going on in American war-making and what can be done locally to talk to our fellow citizens about it. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others. Truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Two resolutions are making their way through the U.S. Congress at the moment that could represent one of the first serious efforts in decades for Congress to reclaim its constitutionally guaranteed authority to declare or not to declare war. House Concurrent Resolution 81 and Senate Joint Resolution 54 could instruct the Pentagon to stop supporting Saudi Arabia in its war in Yemen. The war has so far killed over 10,000 Yemenis and wounded another 40,000 and caused the worst cholera outbreak in history, not to mention the food scarcity, medicine scarcity that Yemen is going through that is unavailable for the civilians there. In a sign that Saudi Arabia is worried that Congress might stop Pentagon's support for the war in Yemen, Prince Mohammed bin Salman is visiting Washington, D.C. this week to lobby for continued support for the war effort. Joining me now to discuss efforts to stop U.S. support for the war in Yemen is Larry Wilkerson. Larry is former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, now a distinguished professor at the College of William and Mary. Larry, good to have you back.
Good to be with you, Sharmini.
Larry, what does the U.S. Constitution say about who has the authority to declare war in the U.S. and why?
Section 1, or Article 1, Section 8, is pretty clear. I think it's crystal clear. And it's crystal clear in both historical terms and in modern terms. It says Congress. It says Congress has the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. Marque and reprisal letters to that effect were essentially authorizations to go out and be pirates, to be privateers for the state, more or less, for the monarchy, to whom in the past all these powers belong, the king, in other words, and in our case, George III. So when the founders, people like Madison and others who knew all these issues and really debated them seriously, later would write about them in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and others, they made sure that all the residue of war, if you will, all the powers associated with war, even this power to declare privateers and allow them to go out and raid your enemy ships, for example, for profit, profit that, of course, ultimately accrued to the monarch because he got that particular item or whatever away from his enemy. Even those things were given to the Congress. So they were very clear. They were just crystal clear that they were taking all the powers that had accrued to the monarch in the past, to the king, and giving them to the Congress of the United States, whom they argued were closer to the American people. They'd love to have given them to the people, but that was not tenable. You couldn't do that. So they gave them to the next best thing, the representatives of the American people, the Congress of the United States, the legislature. That's where the war power was rested. And as far as the Constitution and now the War Powers Act of 1973 is concerned, that's where those powers still are.
Currently, Larry, the U.S. military is providing military aid to Saudi Arabia in the form of arms sales, of course, targeting advice and on-air refueling missions. But in a recent Senate hearing, Senator Elizabeth Warren questioned the head of the U.S. Central Command, General Vortal, whether the U.S. military knows what Saudi Arabia is doing with U.S. support. Here's the exchange between them. Let's listen.
General Vortal, does CENTCOM track the purpose of the missions that it is refueling? In other words, where a U.S. refueled aircraft is going, what targets it strikes, and the results of the mission?
Senator, we do not.
General Vortal, when you receive reports like this from credible media organizations or outside observers, is CENTCOM able to tell whether U.S. fuel or U.S. munitions were used as part of that strike?
Senator, I don't believe we are.
Larry, how can it be that the U.S. military is so uninterested in what U.S. military support is being used for in Saudi Arabia?
I remember listening to that exchange, Sharmini, and I was in one way amused and in another way appalled. For General Votel to say that or to imply that we don't have the ability to do that was simple nonsense when we can track a Russian jet or a Syrian jet to its target and watch it drop its munitions. That's nonsense. What he was saying is we're not applying that high-tech capability to do that, even with a plane every now and then, because we don't want to know. We simply don't want to know, because what we know is those Saudi pilots are often dropping their bombs from very high altitude because they're not courageous enough to go down lower where they might get shot at. And they're very often missing their target, even with the very sophisticated PGMs, precision guided munitions, made for them by such stellar companies as Raytheon. So it was a very disingenuous answer that General Votel gave. And I wish our senators and our representatives had more knowledge and expertise with regard to military operations so they could ask better questions and then follow up on them when they get such a disingenuous answer.
Larry, as I was watching the general, I was wondering whether he was not answering Elizabeth Warren because he realizes the jeopardy he puts himself in, and of course the military of the United States in, if he answers affirmatively or provides any other answer than the one he provided, because this is an illegal war being conducted by Saudi Arabia, and we have the United States military aiding and abiding in that illegal war.
Sharmini, I'd love to say yes, you're right, but I won't, because we committed war crimes during the administration of which I was a part, George W. Bush, ranging from torture to killing innocent civilians. So this is something that the United States does, as Thucydides declared very, very wisely, if sadly, those that have the power do, and those that don't have the power get it done to them.
All right, Larry, turning a little bit in terms of this same issue. Defense Secretary General Mattis recently also weighed in on this debate when he sent a letter to Congress to stop the Sanders Senate Resolution 54 from being passed. In his letter, General Mattis gave three main arguments for continued U.S. support for Saudi Arabia. The first is that Saudi Arabia is acting in self-defense. Second is that without U.S. support, Saudi Arabia would kill even more civilians. And third is that the U.S. needs to support essentially an ally such as Saudi Arabia. What is your reaction to these three arguments?
All three of them are nonsense, and I'm really ashamed of Jim Mattis for making them. I understand the pressure he's under to make them, but the arguments just don't make any sense. First of all, the Saudis are under no threat from the Yemeni. They simply aren't. Second, the implication there, of course, is that the Saudis, and this is an implication that the area's people are taking on board too, are really a proxy of the United States in its war, ongoing war of words and soon to be probably real implements of war, Iran. And the Saudis are acting as our proxy in prosecuting that war. So by that stretch, it's a defensive war against Iran. The idea that the Saudis are not doing things that are beyond the pale with regard to violating humanitarian and other strictures is also not, it's just not operable. It's not the truth. The Saudis are bombing ruthlessly civilian targets indiscriminately. They're bombing food stores and foodstuffs and water sources so that they can't get the clean water they need in order to combat most effectively this cholera epidemic. And the legal argument that they're advancing is simply blown out of the water by all the legal scholars that are worth a damn in this country who talk about Section 8C of the War Powers Act. It's the same argument that the Obama administration lawyers tried to advance initially with regard to Libya, that there weren't any real hostilities there and all we were doing was helping another effort for the right or the responsibility to protect humanitarian operation and so forth. Well, when you're dropping bombs and you're killing people, those are hostilities. I don't care if you're completely immune from it, as we often are because we're doing it from the air where no one can touch us.
but you are engaged in hostilities. And as I said, legal scholars looking at the War Powers Act at Title 50, Chapter 33, Section 1541 to 48, have upheld this view that this is in fact hostilities. So all the arguments that the Secretary of Defense has registered, I might understand why he's registering them, because he sees this as perhaps a return of a little bit of the war power to the Congress. And no military person over there wants that to happen. They want the executive to be able to declare war anytime the executive wants to. And of course, that suits them just fine. They don't want abridgments on the executive's power to start wars, to continue wars, to support other people in their wars, and so forth. But I certainly don't support this particular instance of that happening, because it's an egregious violation of everything we're supposed to value and stand for. And we're doing it, Charmony, we're doing it with the greatest state sponsor of terrorism on the face of the earth. I keep trying to remind the American people that 15 out of 19 of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, and that Saudi money is still going to finance the worst forms of Wahhabism, the worst Salafists, the worst types of terrorists in the name of Islam on the face of the earth. This is just unbelievable that we're still doing this.
Larry, off the top, I indicated that this week we're expecting a visit by Prince Salman to Washington, D.C. In the past, we've discussed the influence that the Saudis have in Washington. Of course, that weighs in. And of course, the prince is also being received with such regalia and fare. I should say he's being received at the White House. He is attending a cultural event at the Kennedy Center. There is apparently a gala dinner being planned for him, all of which is going to be protested by Code Pink and organizers of the peace movement here in the U.S., those struggling to stop the war in Yemen. But give us a sense of how Saudi Arabia has such influence in Washington and why.
Mohammed bin Salman's welcome to Washington has thus far, both in his own spoken words and as some of the actions, as you demonstrated in your commentary, have exemplified, been something akin to welcoming Torquemada of the Inquisition, because yesterday he let a particular individual survive. I mean, this is just insane what they're talking about with regard to this boy king being the great reformer, the great change agent for Saudi Arabia and the House of Saud and so forth. And look at what he's begun to say already. He's begun to say all the things that we who knew what he would say, predicted he would say, that the Saudis are going out of their way, spending countless hours and energy and even dollars to make sure that they don't bomb people that shouldn't be bombed. Well, all the facts argue against that. Sorry, Mohammed bin Salman. He's saying things like Iran is the great perpetrator, the great evil, the great force that Saudi Arabia is really fighting, implying that he's doing it for the United States in Yemen. Well, I'm sorry, Mohammed bin Salman. The Iranians did not even come to Yemen at all in any strength until you started doing what you're doing in Yemen with the UAE and others. The things that he's saying are things that are so propagandistic, so childishly, even infantile. I mean, they don't even register with the level of things that, for example, we did in the first Iraq War, when we were talking about babies being unhooked from their incubators and so forth. Everyone propagandizes, particularly when they're in war, but when you've got money like the Saudis have, and they bought a lot of American companies in order to do this propaganda, you would think that the prince himself could put out some better lines than just these blatant lies and obfuscations and twisting of the truth. But that's essentially what he's doing. And to your question about why, because he's got billions behind him. He can buy American companies to do this for him. He can buy the White House. Let's face it, the only reason that the United States stays cheek and jowl with Saudi Arabia is oil and money. money and oil, oil and money, money and oil. How many times do we have to say it?
And I understand also, Larry, that as we speak, Pentagon is currently considering a $1 billion in new sales of arms and weaponry to Saudi Arabia, and who has to benefit from that? The weapons companies that have such a lobby in Washington.
And also contemplating a whole new panoply of nuclear capability for Saudi Arabia. This is tantamount to real danger here. And talking about that nuclear capability in a way of compromise with the Saudis, who do not want to be hampered in any way in having that capability, such that they would be pretty much free to do, for example, what Iran has already done. That's been the Riyadh side of the argument, that they ought to have the same capacity as Iran. Well, Iran had already gotten up to some 19,000 or so centrifuges, already had a very viable program. If the Saudis want to come in at that level, we might as well just say, here, have a bomb or two.
And as far as I know, Saudi Arabia is also signatory to the NPT.
Yes, and they would probably go into the negotiations with Iran is under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement with Iran. They have this, this, and this, and in 15, 20 years, they'll have this, this, and this. So why don't you just give us everything up front so we're at least in a balanced position with Iran? Well, this is not what the NPT regime was intended for. And Iran's a special case right now, being wrested back, if you will, from a very front-leaning position to a position more in conformity with the NPT, its safeguards agreement, additional protocols, and so forth. And of course, the very robust inspection routine set up under the nuclear agreement itself. So to claim that you have to have equality with Iran, okay, fine, let's sign an agreement with them that's just as draconian as the one we have with Iran.
All right, Larry, I thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll be following the visit of Prince Salman to Washington, D.C. And we hope to have you back at the end of the week.
Well, let's say this, Charmony, everyone should be pushing, everyone who cares should be pushing hard for this Senate Joint Resolution 54. This might be the very first step in getting the Congress to resume its constitutional responsibility for this country killing people.
Thank you for joining us, Larry.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.